On the morning of 6th of November, 1895, inside Alva Vanderbilt's Fifth Avenue mansion facing St. Thomas's Church in Manhattan, a mother's hands smooth, pale kid gloves over her daughter's wrists. Outside, crowds gather for what newspapers are already calling the wedding of the century. The light is pale autumn gold through lace curtains. The room smells faintly of rosewater and anxiety. Consuelo Vanderbilt, 18 years old, sits motionless while her maid fastens seed pearls. Her mother murmurs that tears will spoil the photographs, though none will be allowed inside the church. The ritual looks gentle. The archival record is blunt. Consuelo later recalled being locked in her room to ensure compliance. The gloves, smoothed again, hide the tremor in her hands. From the pews, the chaperones will seem to have succeeded. Reputation intact, alliance secured. At the dressing table, in that small gesture, at the wrist, the cost is harder to dismiss. In March 1877, when Consuelo Vanderbilt was born in Manhattan to railroad heir William Kissam Vanderbilt and his ambitious wife Alva, New York society was learning how to manage a new kind of girl. American, unimaginably rich, and destined to be watched. The infant's name itself was strategy, borrowed from her godmother Consuelo Iznaga, whose own marriage into British aristocracy had proved what titles might be bought with dollars. Family correspondence describes an upbringing arranged like a timetable: tutors, language lessons, writing instruction. From early adolescence, posture drills were enforced with a steel brace running down her spine. In this world, the earliest chaperone is not a hired companion, but the mother. Alva's letters show a woman who saw herself as both architect and guard, deciding which invitations counted, which callers mattered, which glances across a ballroom could harden into hope. The soundscape of those rooms, carriage wheels on cobblestone, the soft creak of whalebone stays, the whisper of kid leather as a girl practices holding gloves and fan just so before gilt-frame mirrors. From birth, a Vanderbilt daughter was not simply raised. She was prepared. Before Consuelo could sign her own name to a dance card, her mother had already begun deciding whose name might appear beside it. By 1887 in New York, Mary Elizabeth Wilson Sherwood was quietly defining the work of chaperones in print. In manners and social usages, she instructed that a young lady's card should almost always be accompanied by that of her mother or her chaperone, framing the older woman as both shield and passport. Sherwood's chapters on courtship describe a chaperone as indispensable to an engaged girl, permitted to accompany couples to theaters and resorts, but warned against unwise surveillance or opening private letters. The tone is brisk, managerial. The chaperone must see everything while appearing to see nothing. She is, Sherwood admits, a slave to other people's engagements. Yet her failure can ruin reputations. In practice, this meant countless watchful gestures. In surviving society photographs, mothers hovered just outside the frame, seated near doorways at balls, visible in corners of garden photographs, placed between daughters and male guests on carriage seats. The rustle of silk and faint creak of chair springs at parlor edges were part of the soundscape of respectable desire. Even before an heiress stepped onto a dance floor, an etiquette book and an older woman had already decided how close she could stand. While New York hostesses read Sherwood, parents across the Northeast sent daughters to institutions designed to make chaperonage easier by making girls safe. In Farmington, Connecticut, in the 1880s, Miss Porter's school promised to train young women as useful Christian wives through academic work, moral instruction, and carefully supervised deportment. Students like Edith Hamilton, who entered in 1883, followed a curriculum mixing Latin and modern languages with music and posture correction. Governesses monitored correspondence. When girls ventured beyond gates, teachers functioned as institutional chaperones. Gloves reappear in the training. Girls learned how to button them neatly, carry them when not worn, remove them before touching piano keyboards in salons. The school's archives record timetables and letters home, reminding parents of proper supervision during holidays. Evidence that education and chaperonage were conceived as continuous projects. The world beyond Farmington might be dazzling, but it was to be entered only with the right habits already worn like invisible uniforms. By the time many heiresses reached their first New York season, they had spent years rehearsing how to be watched. In autumn 1883, as Edith Hamilton arrived at Miss Porter's, another generation practiced their balancing act: Latin declensions in morning, posture, drills in afternoon. School accounts describe corridors where girls walked with books balanced on heads, supervised by teachers correcting every shoulder droop. The physical sensations were precise: tight embrace of corsetry, faint ache between shoulder blades, cool slide of polished floorboards under thin leather soles. Gloves hung from chatelaines, constant reminders that hands must stay controlled, no fidgeting, no expressive gestures that might seem fast. Deportment was not decoration, it was emotional management. Sociologist Cass Wouters would later argue such etiquette systems formed part of broader formalization, disciplining emotions before expression. In Farmington's lesson rooms, girls learned not just what to say, but how to never show too much of what they felt. The same shoulders trained to carry books without wavering would soon carry family ambitions with equal steadiness. By the late 1880s, in drawing rooms from Fifth Avenue to Newport, evenings often began with familiar sequences: lamps lit, piano lids raised, French phrases rehearsed before guests arrived. Records from houses like the Breakers recall music and conversation as civilization markers. Cornelius Vanderbilt II played violin while wife Alice played piano, setting standards their daughters must match. Language tutors, singing teachers, and dancing masters contributed to what historians call the drawing room diplomacy of the Gilded Age, where a young woman's accent, repertoire, and small talk were instruments of alliance. Mothers and hired chaperones sat slightly apart on upholstered chairs, gloved hands folded, listening not only for missed notes but conversational missteps. Too forward a laugh, too long a gaze. Refinement became performance. The parlor was both theater and observation post, the chaperone and unseen stage manager cueing entries and exits with glances. Before an heiress appeared in society columns, she had played her part night after night on the smallest stage, her mother's parlor. In New York, in the late 1880s, a young woman's movements were traced less by maps than by calling cards. Sherwood insisted a debutante's card should almost always be accompanied by her mother's or chaperones. Handbooks repeated the rule. Small pasteboard rectangles preserved in archives record not only names but hierarchies, whose cards could be left together, which addresses merited visits, which could be declined without insult. This was the chaperone's paperwork. She decided which invitations a girl might accept, which theaters were respectable, which Central Park drives required a third person in the carriage. Sherwood specified engaged couples might drive in open carriages, but not closed ones, a detail reminding how closely privacy and danger were linked in social imagination. Each choice left traces in diaries and household books. Mornings spent leaving cards, afternoons preparing for teas, evenings under chandeliers. Long before gossip reached newspapers, it could be read in something as small as the order of stacked calling cards. In New York and Newport ballrooms of the 1880s and 1890s, dancing manuals describe the waltz as both pleasure and test, a way to gauge health, grace, self-control. The dance's closeness made chaperones more, not less, necessary. They stood along walls and in doorways, eyes following daughters turning under crystal chandeliers. Etiquette books insisted on rules: no more than 2 dances with the same partner, no lingering in conservatories, no disappearing into gardens without an older woman nearby. Dance cards record the choreography of surveillance, each penciled name and agreement reached under patient maternal gaze. The sensory detail is vivid: crunch of carriage wheels on gravel outside, hum of waltz time, warmth trapped under gloves as a girl paused between dances to regain breath. Even brief unbuttoning to sip champagne revealed bare wrists for seconds before decorum closed over them again. In the waltz, couples moved as if free, but every turn was calibrated within geometry chaperones maintained. By the 1890s, Etiquette writers were candid about this work's cost. Sherwood called chaperonage little less than slavery, noting good chaperones must sacrifice their own comforts, traveling when charges travel, sitting up when they sit up, always alert, yet never the center of attention. Letters from older women in New York and Newport families echo this fatigue. References to another ball tonight, to watching the girls, from my corner chair, to the strain of maintaining vigilance without overt interference. In one oft-quoted passage, Sherwood warned chaperones against opening charges letters or suspecting without cause, recognizing the line between protection and control. For the chaperone, adjusting a girl's glove before she steps into a ballroom is both tenderness and last defense, the moment when she can still correct, still advise, before the girl vanishes into music and eyes. Guarding an heiress's virtue meant for many older women quietly sacrificing their own chance to be anything but watchful eyes. By the early 1890s, chaperonage logic extended across the Atlantic. Hostesses like Lady Paget, born Mary Minnie Stevens, daughter of American hotel entrepreneur Parran Stevens, made careers introducing American heiresses to titled but indebted European men, effectively chaperoning fortunes rather than feelings. In family papers, we see mothers like Alva Vanderbilt planning European trips with diplomatic intensity. Guest lists, seating charts, visits to country houses where eligible dukes and counts could be inspected under hospitality's cloak. Daughters appeared beautifully dressed and closely watched. Real negotiations happened between elders in side rooms and at writing desks. Society columns recorded engagements like business mergers, listing dowry amounts, titles gained, estates saved. The chaperone, who once guarded against stolen kisses, now guarded against disastrous matches. Disastrous for family status. Emotional compatibility rarely appears as primary concern in archival records. When an heiress crossed the Atlantic, her chaperone's gaze followed, no longer just across drawing rooms, but across currencies and class systems. All currents converge on 6th of November 1895, when Consuelo Vanderbilt walks up St. Thomas's Church aisle in New York to marry Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough. Contemporary reports describe crowds so thick police were required, noting the young bride seemed to have been crying under her veil. Consuelo's memoir, The Glitter and the Gold Records, Coercion Behind Spectacle, her romantic attachment to American suitor Winthrop Rutherford, her mother Alva's determination to secure a dukedom, episodes of physical confinement ensuring obedience. She recalls telling her mother, "I considered I had a right to choose my own husband, only to face what she called a storm of protest." Seen through the chaperonage lens, this is a paradox. The older woman who guarded her daughter's reputation now compels her into unwanted marriage, arguing that the same reputation and the family's place in society demands it. The gloves smoothed one last time become emblems not of protection but acquiescence. On that November morning, the chaperone did not stop the wedding. She ensured the bride walked down the aisle. Marriage did not end surveillance. It transformed it. After Consuelo's arrival at Blenheim Palace in 1895-96, the chaperone role was partly assumed by older members of her husband's family and by English aristocratic society's expectations. In a 1953 newspaper serialization of her memoir, she recalls conversation with her formidable mother-in-law, who greeted her like a deposed sovereign, and informed her that her first duty was producing a son so that little upstart Winston Churchill, would not inherit the dukedom. The language is clinical, transactional. A woman who spent youth being chaperoned is now told her body is defense in dynastic struggle. The physical experience appears in domestic details. Weight of court dress, protocol of royal receptions, requirements to stand for long periods under hot lights and heavier jewels. Gloves, still obligatory, now signify rank. The right fabric and length indicate court status. In this world, there is little room for older female allyship Sherwood imagined. The chaperones are now enforcers benefiting estates more than women. Once married, the heiress discovered virtue was no longer the main thing being guarded. Lineage and property were. By the first decade of the 20th century, etiquette books and sociologists observed traditional chaperonage was on its way out. Cass Wouters, studying courting regimes, cites early 20th century sources noting young ladies increasingly invited to dinners without chaperones, with hostesses themselves counting as sufficient supervision. Sherwood had allowed a loophole. If a woman is protected by the armor of work, she can dispense with a chaperone. Acknowledging paid labor and professional identity could substitute for an older woman's protection. Consuelo herself separated from the Duke in 1906, received divorce in 1921, and remarried Jacques Balsan, building more independent philanthropic and social life in France and the United States. In her memoir, she frames this shift as gradual awakening rather than sudden rebellion, an internal re-chaperoning where she, not her mother, began deciding where she would go and with whom. As formal chaperones disappeared, many women discovered the strictest supervision now lived inside their own habits of self-control. Today, physical traces survive in museums, school archives, and preserved houses. At the Breakers in Newport, audio tours draw on diaries and letters reconstructing daily routines that once governed young women's movements. The Preservation Society's collections include period dress, gowns, fans, gloves, displayed not as romantic curiosities but as evidence of highly regulated worlds. Miss Porter's school, still operating in Farmington, now advertises college preparation rather than training for useful Christian wives. Yet historical materials, catalogs listing music, languages, social instruction remind us of earlier expectations. In a glass case in a costume exhibition, white kid gloves lie flattened beside a dance card and calling card tray, none labeled with a particular heiress's name. The objects stand in for many. Light is carefully controlled to prevent fading. Once, adjusting such gloves was a living gesture of performance and restraint, monitored by chaperones whose names rarely made papers. Now, the gloves can only be looked at. The burden of watching has shifted to historians and viewers who stand before the case and consider what those objects once enforced and what forms of guardianship have replaced them. In the beginning, a mother's fingers smoothed an heiress's gloves before she stepped into the crowd. In the end, the gloves rest motionless under glass, silently asking who is still being protected and at what cost.